most important is the administration of justice. If you are suspected of having committed a crime as a child, and very often these are the poorest. It's the people, the children living on the street, the poor people, the homeless, those who don't have any kind of jobs, and they look suspicious to the police. So the police is arresting them very often. They are beating them up, torturing them, saying you have to confess to this crime. Then they are brought in a pretrial detention facility, and often they're forgotten. I've seen so many children forgotten behind bars because nobody really cares for those poorest of the poor. And they didn't know whether they have seen already a judge, whether they have already been convicted of a crime. Many of them spent much more time in pretrial detention than the maximum sentence would have been if they would have been convicted. So I just said these children have to be immediately released, and many of them actually have been released afterwards. So that's one area. The second is that often parents are sentenced for a crime and spend time in prison, but they might have very, very small kids, in particular mothers. They might still be breastfeeding, and therefore children might be allowed to stay with their mothers or sometimes also fathers or other caregivers in prison because there's no really an alternative. There are very, very little data about that. And of course it's not ideal for a child to grow up in a prison. On the other hand, it might perhaps be even better, in the best interest of the child, if the alternative would be being put in a huge state institution. There you have at least the possibility to bond with your mother, but then the time comes when you have to be separated from your mother. That's also something that is very, very difficult. So what we are saying is mothers with infants, with babies, should actually not be sentenced to prison. There should be always alternatives. So that's the second area. The third is highly controversial, migration-related detention. As you know, in the last years we had so many refugees and migrants, including unaccompanied minors, who migrated from the crisis regions in the world, from Syria, from Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Nigeria, Eritrea and other countries, often in a highly, highly dangerous way with the assistance of smugglers via the Mediterranean, and they're arriving in Greece, they're arriving in Italy, but they are no longer welcome. Europe is no longer a continent that says we actually provide protection for refugees, including refugee children. So that means very often they are immediately detained in overcrowded migration detention centers, now they call them hotspots, etc., in order to be screened there and, if possible, to be returned as quickly back to the countries where they came from. If you think about what happens in the United States, very recently, in order to deter further migration of Latin Americans from Guatemala, El Salvador and other countries in Central and also Southern America, to the United States of America. President Trump is building or wanting to build a big wall, and in order to deter them, he simply ordered to separate even very, very young children, infants, babies, from their mothers and fathers. Can you imagine the suffering of those children? If you're all of a sudden taken away, you are detained here, the parents are detained there. There was so much outcry, and of course we that are involved in the global study on children deprived of liberty, we also criticize strongly these very inhuman policies of the United States, and finally President Trump even had to give in. But now they are no longer separated, but they are again detained together with their parents, which also should not be the case, because there are always other possibilities. So we feel, as UNICEF and also the High Commissioner for Refugees feel, that you should never, as a child, be detained only for migration-related reasons. There are other possibilities where you can stay, and the state has a responsibility to actually provide you with this kind of shelter and food in order to wait until there's a final decision whether you are a refugee or not, whether you have to be sent back or whether you can stay and be integrated into the society. The fourth area are institutions. As I said before, from orphanages to children's homes, to special institutions for children with disabilities who are often still locked away from society in special schools and psychiatric hospitals, etc. Children who have so-called antisocial behavior, who might engage in sex work, in drugs, in alcohol. Many of those kids are brought into institutions. We know that there are millions of children in institutions, and that is a particular area where we want to have an impact, so that there should be policies of de-institutionalization, because children have, first and foremost, a right to grow up in a family environment. Ideally with their own family, even if the parents are not the best parents, they're always better than an institution. And if they are not able to cope with difficult children, then they need to be supported by the state, rather than that the state takes them away from them and puts them in an institution. Sometimes there might be no alternative, or you might have no more parents, but then you should grow up in a foster family, or you should be adopted by another family, or other family type welfare institutions, but not in these big institutions where you are a number and not treated really as children need to be treated, with love in order to develop their talents and skills. There are also a fifth and a sixth area that is dealing with children in armed conflict. As you know, recently many also armed and terrorist groups like the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, Boko Haram in Nigeria, the Al-Shabaab militias in Somalia, etc. They were forcibly recruiting young children in order to fight for them, and many of them were killed, but also girls were recruited for sexual exploitation, forced marriages with ISIS fighters, etc. And now ISIS is more or less defeated. But what do we do with those children? They are now detained in Iraq by the Iraqi government, or in Syria by the Kurdish authorities, and many of them are European citizens. But Europe doesn't want to take them back because they are terrorists. Shall they remain there in detention? How do we deal with them? They are victims, they are not perpetrators. And we have to also find, even for those persons who are seen to be part of terrorism, empathy, because they are children. They have a right to also get out of this environment and be reintegrated into France or Germany or other European societies where they often have their citizenship of these countries. So these are the different areas. We're also looking into cross-cutting issues like gender. There's a strong gender dimension. Disability is a very important aspect. We also look into child participation. If you are preparing a global study on children deprived of liberty, you have to include the voices of children. So we interviewed hundreds of children all around the world to see what they actually have to say about what are their needs, what can be done in order not to get behind bars or to get out of prison.